Welcome to the University of Delaware. I'm Lawrence Cunningham, director of the John L. Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance here. This is our fourth annual exploration of the changing landscape that directors faced in the ESG space. How many people have attended prior annual installments of this session? Let's see a show of hands. About half, and so we'll ask the opposite question. For how many is this the first time here? About half. It's a good mix. Well, welcome everyone. I know we have a diverse group of people, students, professors, and writers, directors and investors, attorneys, and accountants. I'd also like to salute the Weinberg Center Advisory Board members who are here and thank them for their service. I'd also like to thank the Weinberg Center's Myron T. Steele Fellows and research assistants, and I'd like to recognize and thank my colleague Nicole Rich, who has coordinated this event. How many students do we have in attendance? Are there any students here? We have quite a few, it looks like. And don't forget about the student writing competition. I hope you will enter that. There's information about it on our website and also a handout at the registration table. We look forward to a rich discussion with our two panels today, moderated by me and by my colleague, Cravath partner and Weinberg Center Advisory Board member John White, who founded this series of ESG in the boardroom 4 years ago. And the agenda and panelists are listed on the slide. We'll have two panels with a break in between, followed by a reception in that delightful, enchanting living room with the fireplace at the end. I'd like to welcome our panelists who bring a wide range of professional perspectives and individual personal philosophies. Their collective experience is broad, and many of them wear multiple hats. So we're blessed with the nearly dozen panelists. We have 5 lawyers, 4 accountants, 3 directors, 3 university professors, 2 investing professionals, but no partridge in a pear tree. However, we do have on the panel 4 members of the Weinberg Center Advisory Board, as well as a trustee of the University of Delaware. Our first panel is assembled here. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order, though they are sitting in a different order. Donna Anderson from the investing firm T. Rowe Price, just about in the middle. Michael Arnold next to her from the New York law firm of Cravath. Mary Francis at the end from the General Counsel's Office at Chevron Corporation. Bill Lafferty next to Mary from the Delaware law firm of Morris Nichols, and he is the University of Delaware trustee in our midst. Michael Montalongo, Public Company Director, second from the end, and Ann Sheehan, also Public Company Director, sitting right next to Michael. Joining the next panel later in the program will be Paul Beswick from the large accounting firm of Ernst & Young, and Polia Nair from the mid-sized accounting firm Cohn Resnick, and Kent St. Pierre, who is an emeritus accounting professor from here at the University of Delaware. Please note that the panelists speak for themselves and not necessarily for their organizations. Let's start the gathering by giving a warm round of applause to our panelists today. Thank you all very much for participating in this event. Now, I'll just spend a few minutes introducing the ESG landscape with a brisk slide presentation. The slides are printed and available at the registration area, and my remarks will pretty much follow that summary on the screen, which may help explain why many feel whiplash in the past few years. After ESG's slow rise from 2004, it surged in 2020 and 21, and then hit a growing backlash in the past 3 years, which the Financial Times declared to be a bust. And I think a sense of history is needed to understand today's boardroom challenges. So back in 2014, the United Nations launched the ESG movement with almost incontestable aspirations like ending war, hunger, and poverty, and promoting sustainability, which it defined as using resources to meet current needs without depleting resources that future generations might require. Quick quiz, show of hands, how many people knew that the UN launched ESG? How many people is that news to? Good. Learn something new every day. The early ideas around ESG centered on virtuous ideas like energy efficiency, employee engagement, and anti-corruption policies. The UN even laid out management strategies to advance agendas, setting out examples of different types of industries or businesses and how they could contribute to these goals. It also recommended investment strategies of how to incorporate ESG factors into investment thinking. Some managers even decided to avoid certain sectors that weren't consistent with the UN's principles, and some even prioritized social impact over economic returns. Over the next decade, ESG's appeal grew, driven by the virtuous ring of sustainability, plus social movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, which emphasized gender and racial priorities, along with a decline in government or trust in government. These gathering forces promoted a powerful and vast ESG ecosystem that generates hundreds of billions in annual revenue across a wide spectrum: data providers, standard setters, framework developers, coalitions, professional services firms, money managers, all of which attracted many new and diverse interest groups to pursue agendas across a wide range of topics, all under the ESG mantle. As a result of that ambition, tensions emerged, with fundamental debates over things like mandates versus market freedom, corporate versus government roles, and capitalism itself. Concerns included ESG imposters, doubts about promised financial returns, and allegations that some asset managers prioritize personal interests. The battle of ideas reached into the boardroom through shareholder proposals and through state houses vying over competing legislation. Here, this slide, I think, depicts better than anything the rise and stall of ESG. This tracks investor inflows and outflows of ESG funds. You see it was a slow and steady rise until 2019 and 2020, when it soared and peaked. And then in the last 3 years has been steadily seeing withdrawals. During that 3-year period, it's no coincidence that each of the prongs in the E, S, and the G have faltered. The E has weakened as big banks have withdrawn from environmental coalitions. The S sputtered after court rulings holding race-based affirmative action unconstitutional, which provoked many companies to reconsider their diversity policies. And the G became overly prescriptive. It's very contrary to traditional approaches to corporate governance. In short, by 2024, ESG came to stand for a set of values very different from those the UN envisioned 20 years earlier, and some of those values were supported with a degree of zealotry that produced backlash. Some of that backlash also being pushed by zealots. Those opposing forces make it very difficult for many boards of directors to operate as they would like to do. And that is the reason for convening this conference. That is the reason why the Weinberg Center began doing it 4 years ago. It's to help directors and those who advise them navigate the dynamic landscape. And there is no better person to help us do that than Weinberg Center board member who launched this program 4 years ago, who, it might be a secret, was my boss, I won't say how many years ago, when I started practicing at Cravath, one of the best bosses I've had in my career. John White also then served as the director of the Division of Corporation Finance at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and through these roles really has an ear to the ground with all of the leaders in this space. And I think he's even, it's fair to say, offering them sound advice on some of these challenging topics. So I'd like to turn the podium, the seat anyway, over to the founder of this series of programs, to whom I think we're all extremely grateful, John White. And maybe please give John a round of applause.
Wow, Larry, so you're telling all these secrets about you and me. I should mention that anybody who knows me knows that all I care about is accounting, and that's what I spent all my time teaching Larry at the time. And he then left and started writing books about accounting, which he would send me free copies of. I don't know how you became a governance lawyer later, but I should point that out. Anyway, welcome to the fourth version of our ESG program. I guess I'd say it's been quite a journey, and Larry has laid out part of that journey. One thing I'm kind of excited about today is I know many of you have seen earlier versions of this, and there are 4 of us up here who have been on earlier programs, but probably more exciting, there are 7 new members of the faculty up here. So you're really going to get some new viewpoints from at least 7 people that you haven't heard on these topics before. Obviously, particularly excited that Larry is my co-moderator, the new director of the center. So Larry, how about a round of applause for Larry? Why not? And progressing from the accounting world. So I have tried to have 2 consistent themes across each of the programs, and I hope we achieve that today as well. One of those is for this to be we're in Delaware, but for this to be board focused. So our goal is to, I'll say talk to directors, but really talk to people who advise directors, but to look at ESG from the perspective of directors and what they do. And the second theme is practical advice. I will get excited every time I see you with your pencil out writing something down. I'll probably say I have 3 points to make or something like that to try to get you to write it down, but that I hope we will be able to get across on practical advice. As you probably have figured out, I love SEC things, and most of the SEC stuff is going to be talked about on the second panel. But given the administration change and all the stuff that was happening, I thought it would be useful if we just spent a few minutes previewing, I guess, some of the stuff that's going to be on the second panel, but just kind of level setting in terms of what's been happening at the SEC and where that fits in. So I have just 2 slides don't have quite as many graphics as Larry did, but in any event. So the first slide is just laying out the more recent events by the SEC with respect to climate change. Go back to 2010, there was commission-level guidance. That means the SEC itself was issuing it on disclosure about climate change. I think we would describe it as principles-based, focusing on materiality, and different than the recent rules, did not contain any metrics or required metrics. That was then followed by the most recent administration, before the change in administration, the Gensler administration. CorpFin issued actually a sample comment letter about what you should be saying in your disclosures with respect to climate matters, fairly detailed letter. Soon after that, the SEC proposed rules came out in March of 22, massive set of disclosure rules. 2 years later, just a few days after we had the 3rd version of this conference, the final rules came out. They were somewhat pared back, but still had significant required disclosures with respect to greenhouse gases and an accounting footnote and some other things. After those rules came out on March 6th of last year, 2 weeks later, well, actually, a day later, the litigation started getting filed to challenge the rules. 2 weeks later, after there were, I don't know, half a dozen or a dozen cases filed in various federal circuits, it was all consolidated in the 8th Circuit. And 2 weeks after that, the SEC stayed the effectiveness of the rules before they became effective. That happened in April of last year. That litigation has been progressing along, and then I could say, knowing this, we were going to have this conference and giving us something to talk about, but interestingly, earlier this week, the acting chair of the SEC, Mark Ueda, put out a statement directing the staff to request the Eighth Circuit, and I'm going to read the words, they're on the bottom of the slides, not to schedule the case for argument to provide time for the commission to deliberate and determine the appropriate next steps in these cases. Pretty extraordinary, but basically the SEC, who is the defendant in those cases, is asking that they stop and wait while they can try to figure out what the next steps are. We will later on talk about some of the predictions of how they're going to do that. But anyway, that's kind of what's happened at the SEC recently. I thought, going to the next slide if we could, I wanted to talk just a little bit about who the deciders are when we talk about it. When I say the SEC, who is it and who's making the decisions there today? So President Trump has nominated Paul Atkins, a Republican, to be the next chair of the SEC. He's very experienced. He's been on the staff. He's been an SEC commissioner. Other things up there on the screen about him. But certainly the most notable thing with respect to the center and this audience, in Donna's seat right down here in the middle, when we were here 1 year ago today, Paul Atkins was there. He was actually leading a key participant in the ESG backlash part of our discussion. But Larry, I mean, I know.
Well, see what I mean about John White knowing everybody and having his ear to the ground? That was due to John White. So thank you very much for having Paul here, John.
We considered inviting him this time, but we figured he'd already been nominated, so it didn't quite seem like we were going to get him here. All right, so just so we understand kind of the way it's set up, the SEC today, February 13, is 3 members. It is acting chairman Mark Ueda, a Republican, Hester Peirce, a Republican, and Caroline Crenshaw, a Democrat. So it's 2-1 Republicans. There is a quorum requirement of 3. So you can see that you could have difficulties getting certain things done where the commission had to act because they all have to show up for a meeting. So Paul Atkins has been nominated. He will presumably, he's very well qualified. I think we all expect his nomination will move through expeditiously. He presumably will become chair of the SEC sometime, not predicting, but I'll just say in April, something like that. At that point, it will be 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat. The quorum remains 3. So at that point, the 3 Republicans will have the votes and the people present to be able to do what they effectively want to do. One of the things I think a lot of people don't quite understand is the acting chair of the SEC has all of the powers that the chair does. So Mark Ueda, as the acting chair, has the full power. The other thing that I don't think a lot of people realize, with the exception of a couple of dozen people that work for the commissioners, all 3,000 employees at the SEC work for the chair. So the entire SEC works for acting chair Ueda now. So he has the full power of what he wants to do. I guess I'd also say there aren't a lot of restraints on that power, other than, generally speaking, that the acting chair doesn't like to do things that would, upset the chair when he gets there or interfere with his confirmation. So I think that probably, they're going to, as acting chair, he's going to be restrained in that sense. But I should point out that when Paul Atkins was on the commission earlier, which was actually the same time that I was there, so he was one of the commissioners when I was there, two of his law clerks were Mark Ueda and Hester Peirce. So one has to assume that they've been together for quite some time and are, I'll say, relatively aligned. So final comment, looking at what, as acting chair, Mark Ueda can do, he's done a number of things already, but he did 3 things this week which will come up in our, we're only on Thursday, by the way. I don't know what he's done today, if you follow your phones as we're talking. But the first thing he did is he had the Eighth Circuit pause request, which I just referred to in the earlier slide. He also had the staff, I guess I would say, modify, update their no action letter policy with respect to shareholder proposals in a way that will limit the number of ESG proposals that are go into proxies. And third, he put out the staff put out a CDI, as they call it, with respect to 13D and 13G that really impacts shareholders when they are engaging with management and directors, something that will come up when we're talking later today. And notice he did all of those things as acting chair because he had power to do those things as the acting chair. None of those required commission action. Anyway, so that's kind of background of what's been happening at the SEC, including 3 things this week. So that's my intro, Larry. We'll now turn it over to you to lead us through the first
Excellent.
panel.
Well, thank you very much. So now you've got a little bit of the history and where we are now and a glimpse of what's to come. And I'd first like to deepen that current look at recent developments by turning to Mike Arnold, who also has his thumb on the pulse of this, and just update us on the state of play in ESG, starting with environmental. John's talked a lot about the SEC. That California has its own approach to this. The EU has an approach. Can you update us on each of those 3 jurisdictions briefly, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely. So the bottom line on the SEC, I'll start with the punchline first, are the climate rules that we discussed at length at prior iterations of this panel and that John described, are those rules going into effect, after all they've been adopted by the SEC? No. 0% chance. There is no chance that the rules that were adopted by the SEC will actually go into effect as they are drafted. That's the easy part. How you get from A to B is actually much more complicated, and I think the statement that came earlier from Acting Chairman Ueda, is the first step in uncovering exactly how the SEC, from kind of a strategic perspective, is going to move from A to B on whether the SEC climate rules go into effect. So there's a few different sort of tactical options. Unlike some of the guidance-related or staff-level kind of guidance and rules that are put out not by commission action, that can be just changed, as John was describing, at the direction of the acting chair and through staff action. Because the SEC rules were adopted through notice and comment rulemaking, repealing them would also require notice and comment rulemaking. So there would be a period for 30 to 60 days, 90 days for people to write and say that, oh, actually, no, if you wanted to revise or repeal the SEC climate disclosure rules, here is why you shouldn't do that, and the SEC would need to do an economic analysis. That would be subject to litigation without a doubt, et cetera. So that's one possibility. They could just do rulemaking to effectively repeal the previously adopted rules. Another way that they could handle this is they could do rulemaking to adopt different but similar rules. That would also require notice and comment rulemaking. Conceivably, it could be something that's like, at a very high level, materiality qualified, principles based, no expectation that companies would have to provide a disclosure, tell us about how climate risk affects you. Essentially something derived from the 2010 climate guidance that John described in his intro. That's also, I think, a possibility. There may be kind of strategic reasons why that would be advantageous, but it's a possibility. Also, there is litigation, as we know, in the Eighth Circuit, challenging the rules. Another way that the SEC could, attack the problem is just stop defending the rules in the court challenge. I think that's a little bit tricky because there are certainly some aspects of the litigation challenge that I think the SEC would want to keep. First Amendment challenges, for example, that it's compelled corporate speech. Well, the SEC is all about compelling corporate speech, right? Like, that's good for the SEC regardless of your political orientation. So I think it's, a question at least whether the SEC would want to sort of fold entirely. But, other challenges that are being raised are things like the major questions doctrine, the cost-benefit analysis. I think the SEC would be perfectly happy if they lost on that litigation. So it's possible what comes out of this pause is something along those lines. So in any event, I think we will see. I think we'll know more, sooner rather than later. But in any event, the rules are not going to go into effect as they were previously adopted. Now, if you talk to people who are very active in the ESG space and you ask them about that, that elicits a shrug. And that may be surprising because the SEC climate rules were truly transformative, right? I mean, they're one of the more ambitious rulemaking that the SEC has done since SOX or probably ever. And yet, for the most part, a lot of, pro-ESG, let's call them, people are actually not too fussed if the SEC gets rid of their climate disclosure rules. And California, the next jurisdiction that you mentioned, is the reason why. So California has adopted their own climate disclosure rules that apply to companies that do business in California, which is essentially if you breathe in the direction of California. It's not entirely clear exactly how California is going to define that term, but rest assured it will be a low threshold of what constitutes doing business in California and meet certain kind of size and turnover thresholds to avoid picking up too many small businesses. So if you do business in California and meet these thresholds, you need to disclose climate-related risks and some quantified measures of greenhouse gas emissions, similar in some ways to what the SEC put out in their disclosure rules. This being the United States, of course, those were also immediately subject to litigation. So no surprise there, as also a day after they were propounded, of course, they were also sued. Within the last week or two, there have been
They were actually in litigation before the SEC rules, right?
Correct. I think that's right.
Their proposal was out.
I think they came out.
We talked
before.
about this last year.
Yeah, correct, because it actually reduced the cost benefit. It helped the SEC's cost benefit analysis if a lot of companies had to collect this data anyway to comply with the California rules. So
Bootstrap.
There's all sorts of strategy. Yes, correct. So the California rules are the subject of litigation on a number of different theories. Earlier this month, the court rejected some of the theories on which it was being challenged. For example, does this unduly burden interstate commerce? The court said, no, we're not, that challenge is not going ahead. Certain other challenges about, First Amendment challenges are going ahead. What I think is very interesting, and as I think we talked about at the panel last year, and potentially troubling does this portend a 50-state ESG disclosure regime where I have to do my California, climate report, I have to do my West Virginia coal usage report, I have to do my Louisiana, wetlands report? Do I have to, comply both with blue state ESG requirements and red state ESG requirements? Certainly for my clients, that's the nightmare scenario, right? Like the fragmentation of ESG into a 50-state regime is, I think, very troubling and something that we'll really want to monitor going forward, especially if the California rules are upheld.
Can I just interrupt there?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, that sounds a little bit, it reminds me of the blue sky laws a little bit.
Well,
that have
yes.
that same sort of problem. Is it?
Which are also a pain.
Yeah.
As a practitioner in capital markets, the blue sky laws, which are state securities laws, so the SEC obviously has its own securities laws, and it says, there are certain things you need to do to comply to federal level with securities. Blue sky laws are also state securities laws, which are very clearly not preempted by the federal rules, and so, every state has their own laws as well, which are, range from more to less burdensome depending on what you want to work at. But yes, that is, if it's blue sky laws on steroids, where it is much more burdensome and requires companies to be, taking stands on sensitive issues, I think that's potentially very troubling for, big companies who are operating across the nation.
Thank you. You want to go over to Europe now?
Yeah, so unsurprisingly, Europe is way ahead of the US on climate disclosure rules and really ESG rules more generally. So there's sort of two regimes to know that we could spend 3 hours talking about them in general, but so CSRD and CS3D. This is an ESG conference, so get ready for a deluge of acronyms. The punchline on each of these is there are requirements to disclose not on a quote-unquote single materiality basis, i.e. you are not disclosing ESG-related information that only affects the company, but a double materiality basis that affects how the company affects the world externally as well on ESG-related issues. That makes the burden of compliance and reporting much higher. It's a much more stringent regime. And while these are European regimes, if you are a US company that does business in Europe, not quite the California understanding of does business, but there's a lot of big companies that are picked up by it, you are going to be subject to CSRD and CS3D as a result of your European operations.
Excellent. Michael, can we move to S?
One more sentence on this. U.S. companies hate this, and so there have been some noises from even as recently as this week that there are potential trade tools to try to protect U.S. companies from being subject to CSRD and CS3D. More to come on that front.
Excellent. Thank you. We're going to move to the S. Sticking with Michael, there has been some news this week on S, that's the social and ESG, from the Institutional Shareholder Services proxy advisor firm announcing that forthwith it will no longer, in its sort of primary assessments of directors in elections, evaluate the diversity makeup of a board or a person. That's a sea change, and it's part of a backlash, I guess is the word for it, against diversity, equity, inclusion. I mentioned that a number of companies have revisited their policies. Some of them have withdrawn them, others are sticking in. Michael, I know you probably don't want to name names, but can you describe some of the efforts or assessments and the positions companies are taking?
Yeah, so there is no conversation I've had with clients more in the last 2 weeks than this topic. And given that we're in 10K season and earnings season, that's saying something. I mean, clients are very, very focused on these issues. What is sort of the precipitating event for why are companies, reassessing their DEI policies? The answer is the executive orders and the flurry of executive orders that came right after inauguration. Those executive orders included both sort of, substantive restrictions on, companies that do business with the federal government, federal contractors, about to what extent do they have DEI programs. But perhaps more interestingly and more influentially on the market in general, there were instructions that each agency should come up with a list of 9 companies that they, are public companies, large private companies, foundations, educational institutions, endowments, et cetera, that they are going to investigate for having illegal DEI practices. I think it's important to underscore that the executive orders that came in the 3rd week of January didn't really change the law on, the Civil Rights Act. Everything that was illegal before remains illegal. It is illegal to have quotas. It's illegal to use, race as a method or reason for hiring and firing. Those are still the same, but clearly there is a much more rigorous enforcement of those on the horizon, and companies are very attuned to the potential for being on the short list of 9 companies that are going to be investigated by the various agencies. So what you're seeing is companies first
Why 9, Michael?
Say it again?
Why 9?
Yeah. So what are people, doing? Changing the wording is one. I mean, in the rise and fall of ESG, there's been no more popular thing to do than change how you talk about the stuff you are already doing.
You're talking about what directors should be doing, that making sure their companies are doing?
Perfect. Yes. Let's remember our director focus here. So if you want one of the 3 things to write down, if you're a director in the audience, ask the people who are manage your hiring and firing, are we changing any of our policies about, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion? Are we going more towards inclusion as opposed to diversity and equity? Are we rebranding these as programs related to belonging? That's a very common solution as well. So that's sort of one thing is just,
Could I just stop you? Mary, I think you have mentioned this before, but Are you like doing a search of your website to make sure every time DEI is mentioned that you're still happy that it's mentioned like that?
We don't mention DEI. We don't use the E, but we have been since prior to. I mean, there's the Robbie Starbuck element out there as well. There's been some attention to how are we communicating on the practices we've used for decades. It's really rooted in a philosophy, but how you communicate it and how you talk about it really matters.
Michael, can I get your an additional thought from you? You highlighted the executive orders as being a catalyst. I think you're absolutely right, but this reevaluation of these policies goes back to 23, 24, and I can name some names, a whole list of companies, John Deere, Molson, Ford, on and on. What was driving that?
Yeah, so two factors. First, the affirmative action case at the Supreme Court. While it did not really affect the hiring and firing practices because it's a different title of the Civil Rights Act, clearly it was a indication of how the Supreme Court understands the provisions of the Civil Rights Act, as a more, let's call it colorblind sort of interpretation of those provisions as opposed to anything else. So there was the writing on the wall that this was sort of the direction of travel from a judicial perspective. The others, and Mary hit the nail on the head when she said Robbie Starbuck, is just customer-related backlash. I think I gave this talking point because I do it in a lot of them in the last year. The companies that were at risk for ESG-related backlash, if you're headquartered in a red state, if you have extensive sort of operations with the government such that there are ways that they could, make conditions on your participation in certain programs, or if you're a household name that there can be political points scored dragging you in front of Congress or, opening an investigation, et cetera. It's just that's now expanded, and there are plenty of activists who are willing to kind of raise those issues on their own. So for example, Robbie Starbuck, who has a very prominent Twitter following, really honed in on sort of the red state kinds of companies, John Deere, Tractor Supply, and tried to drive a publicity campaign targeted towards customers that claimed that the corporate actions were not aligned with the values of the customers.
Michael, let me just ask you one more question before we take you off the hot seat. There was a district court case in Texas just a couple weeks ago about the ERISA duties of pension managers at American Airlines, I think it was, and it held that, at least preliminarily, these folks had violated that statute by prioritizing certain ESG goals. Can you summarize that case for us a bit and tell us what its implications are for this landscape?
Yeah, no one wants to hear 3 hours on ERISA fiduciary duties. I promise you that that's not the topic that you signed up for, so I'll be even more brief than that. Effectively, did American Airlines, which had a partner who had used BlackRock to, for its 401k, et cetera, were they sort of inappropriately allowing BlackRock to conduct, quote, ESG investing? Now, this reminds me of, I think it was ESG 1.0. The first time that we did this program, Sebastian Niles, then a partner at Wachtell, gave a very interesting, I think it was 14, did he have 14 different ways that you can think about ESG? Whether that's like making an impact on the world or whether it's a risk mitigation tool. It's very clear from that decision that what the court found was that BlackRock was doing ESG investing in the sense of trying to make an impact on the world. They're not using it as a risk mitigation tool. They're not using ESG factors as a means of financial return. At least according to the court, they were trying to change the world and alter kind of corporate behavior. And according to the court, that is separate and apart and a violation of ERISA duties to maximize sort of pecuniary returns. So if that theory is upheld and is expanded, I think that what you will likely see is, financial institutions making clear that if they are using ESG factors, they are doing it in services of getting financial returns. We're doing it as a long-term risk mitigation tool, because I think that would help if these sorts of arguments become more common and more widely deployed.
Brilliant summary without being too much into the details. If ERISA is not a fascinating legal subject, I know this room will agree with me that Delaware corporate law is. And since this is a panel for directors, it'd be very helpful to get a baseline setting of what are the duties of directors of Delaware companies in this ESG environment. There's no better expert on this topic than Bill Rafferty. Bill, can you give us a thumbnail sketch of the framework of Delaware director duties?
I will, Larry, thanks. And Larry neglected to mention, although he looks a lot younger than me, he and I both graduated from the University of Delaware in 1985, so both as finance majors as well. So followed our passion
You're better looking
into the
even if I
law.
look younger.
So
But you weren't trained in accounting by me.
There you go.
that's true, and I don't have that. I don't have that on my resume for sure. Let me give, I want to do a couple things. One is I wanted to give a little bit of an overview, I guess, of what I see as the standards applying, and then I wanted to answer one specific question. I wanted to give some guidance around best practices on what to do in this space. And then if I have time, just to hit two cases that have touched on this in the last year, and I think they're both very interesting cases. So I would say this, as a general rule, directors' decisions relating to ESG, and I'm going to put in ESG the DEI things that Michael had mentioned, they're going to be subject to review under the business judgment rule, rather than a more exacting standard like the entire fairness standard. And look, that said, there could be some weird scenario where a controlling stockholder or management somehow gets out in front of the board and the board abdicates decision-making on an ESG or a DEI issue to that, controller or management, and then somehow you could, you get harm to the company from that. You could have a situation where some standard other than business judgment. I'm not going to talk about that today because I think that's a bit more far-fetched. And if you follow best practices, you won't allow that to happen. But the business judgment rule, for those of you who are non-lawyers here, is the most deferential standard review in Delaware. And it's the presumption that directors act in accordance with their traditional fiduciary duties of care and loyalty. And under the business judgment rule, courts aren't going to, they're going to refrain from unreasonably imposing themselves on the business decisions that the board makes, as long as the board's decision can be attributed to some rational business purpose. So, and I would just say this, the business judgment rule has remained stable over the period covering the boom and the bust of ESG. I don't think it's, the way we formulated it in Delaware, the courts have stuck by that over the years and applied it pretty consistently. And I guess I would say it this way, which is, I think Delaware law vests significant discretion to directors to guide corporate strategy, and that would include on environmental, social, governance, and political issues. And given, I think, the diversity of viewpoints that management, stockholders, other stakeholders, directors, that they have, corporate speech on external policy matters like ESG brings both risks and opportunities, right? I mean, but it is fundamentally, though, the board that's empowered to weigh all the competing considerations and decide whether it's in the corporation's best interest to act or not act on matters relating to ESG. And I guess the way I think of it is directors, can and I think should consider a broad spectrum of issues when they're making decisions about what's going to maximize the long-term value of the firm, including how the decision's going to affect stakeholders, the economy, society, the broader issues that are encompassed, I think, within ESG, DEI-related issues.
Yeah, you mentioned that the business judgment rule is sort of judicial deference to boards. They're presumed to make as long as they make a decision that's in the best business interest of the company. Don't they have to focus on the shareholder interest? Isn't that a primary value here, or can they equally consider other stakeholders?
The fundamental focus, I think, is on maximizing the value of the firm for the benefit of stockholders. But in getting there, Larry, you can consider a broad array of factors. And one of the cases I want to talk about is this Disney case. But you certainly can consider the interests of your employees and sometimes in the public and environmental issues and broader issues that, as long as the board is considering it in the realm of what are we doing to maximize the long-term value of the company for the benefit of stockholders. And all of those factors, a board reasonably, I think, very well could conclude that paying its employees more is better for the long-term value of of the company and to the benefit of stockholders. The board reasonably could conclude that, not polluting is a good idea, and it's in the best interest of the shareholders and, in building long-term value. So I think like I say, I think the board has a lot of discretion in this area.
Is there a risk, though, that the board might stick its neck out into a political thicket? I think that might have been what happened in Disney. I'd love to get your thoughts on that risk.
Can I talk about the Disney case? I'd like to take you through it a little bit. For those of you who don't remember, there was a case that came out a little bit over a year and a half ago. There was a Disney stockholder who had sought books and records from the company, supposedly to investigate wrongdoing at the board level in terms of how the board at Disney had handled the company's position about a law that was proposed in Florida called the Parental Rights and Education Act, what was commonly became known as the Don't Say Gay law. And the plaintiff's theory in the case was that the Disney's board had put their own beliefs ahead of their obligations to stockholders and flouted the risk of losing these valuable rights they had associated with the special tax district that Walt Disney World is within. And the court, it was Vice Chancellor Will, wrote a really, really interesting opinion. I thought it was a great opinion. That I think is the most apt opinion that's out there around these issues. And the court started out by saying, noted that there are these weighty public policy questions around the margins of the lawsuit, but when stripped away, the case was quite simple. Plaintiff had the burden to come in and show that it had a proper purpose. It lost. It didn't do that. And the court basically, it went through the record that the board had created in terms of the things that it had factored into its decision to come out publicly and oppose that law. And it was by and large because its employees, like a lot of the creative talent that puts a lot of effort into Disney, were incredibly upset by it. And the board had a special meeting to consider the precise issue on the table relating to what should the company's position be vis-a-vis this law. And they weighed the pros and cons of acting, and they decided to come out publicly against the law. And they took a lot of heat for that. But ultimately, the court said there was no basis to presume the board violated its fiduciary duties in balancing the different considerations. And I thought there was a couple of solid points that I think are directly on point. And the court said, although choosing to speak or not speak on public policy issues is an ordinary business decision, this case exemplifies the challenges a corporation faces when addressing divisive topics, particularly ones that are external. And individual investors, they have these diverse interests, but they share beyond the shared goal of corporate profitability. And viewpoints, they may not always align on the same political, religious, and other social matters, yet stockholders invest with the understanding that the board's empowered to direct the corporation's affairs. And the board, while may delegate, implementation of management, it alone bears the ultimate responsibility for establishing corporate policy. And I think that to me was as strong as you can say in favor of the board can take all these factors into consideration in deciding, what to do on these
So,
I think
Bill,
very
just
meaty
to
policy issues.
tie this into backlash, if a board decides to, I'll say, follow pressure from the administration and their direction today, does that fit within what you're describing? I mean, can you do that? Do you have risk with doing that?
If the board decides to, sort
Comply.
of give in to the backlash idea and
Yeah.
do away with some of their ESG or DEI-related issues. Look, I think, again, the board's going to be given wide latitude in considering these issues, I think. And if it decides that, again, factoring it into the long-term best interests of the firm and the shareholders, that it's time to step back publicly and to maybe you keep the certain things in place, but maybe you scrub the website. You don't want to take the heat. I think there's a lot of different things the board can do, and I think it's going to be given wide discretion.
I just mean, being practical here, Michael
Yeah.
said it, that is the question, at least that Michael and I are hearing more than anything else today
Yeah.
from our clients, is what do we do today, given?
Well, let's take, one of the insights from that opinion is that the directors have a role in directing and sort of moving strategy, but management has a role too. And I think one of the hardest things directors have to do is identify and then respect that line. And we've got a couple directors sitting here. I'd love to have your perspectives on that. The NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, has a famous mantra that says the director's job is to have her nose in and fingers out. So a lot of sniffing, asking, probing, trying to discern, but not really. Certainly not micromanaging, not even managing, and maybe not even entering too much into some of these areas. Michael, I know you've thought a lot about this boundary or this nose in, finger out. What's your view on how it operates in this ESG setting?
Thank you for posing the question, Larry, and also thank you for the opportunity to be here with these wonderful colleagues here. That particular tension is almost a perennial one in the boardroom, right? In terms of where is the line between oversight and then proactive or active managing and so forth. And in many ways, it's really something that, even though, for instance, the NACD has coined that term, and it's a decent rule of thumb, it's going to differ with each company, depending on the stage or phase or environment or the situation that the business situation that the company finds itself in. So as an example, there's sort of an evolutionary cycle with all businesses, a maturity cycle, if you will, startup and then going into later phases of maturity. So at the startup stage, as an example, you're going to find that directors will probably be expected to play a more hands-on, maybe even operating set of responsibilities to some degree, right? But then as the company matures, then the line begins to be a bit brighter, where there's, certainly by the management team, there's an expectation that they are the ones that are expected to implement, execute, operationally execute, run the daily operations of the company, whereas directors will just exercise oversight on strategy, performance monitoring, etc. With the topic of ESG, I don't see that it's necessarily any different in terms of how directors would approach that in terms of their roles and responsibilities vis-a-vis management. In fact, for me, in the boardroom, especially since I predominantly am in audit committees and chair audit committees, this is an area that I sort of fold into the risk management area. And so I think it falls very neatly there quite well.
Yeah, the Disney case, well, tell us your view on the Disney case. I mean, that was a question about should the company take a public position on a controversial topic? What are the pros and cons? And who should decide that? And what role should the board play in that decision?
Yeah, look, that's a loaded, I think that's a loaded one because if you look at historically, traditionally, business has been neutral with respect to public policy issues. And we can talk about this at a later question in terms of, you know, what is the role and responsibility of business and of the private sector in the public square. You know, my view is that I think some of you know that I started out in my career in the military, and one of the things I learned very early as a young lieutenant is that you stay in your lane. Mm-hmm. But this is now something that I learned so many decades ago. But I think that there's some relevance to that in the sense that the private sector has its sort of lane, and the public square has its lane. And something like social issues, maybe ESG as an example, those are, again, my view, predominantly public square, public issues to be decided by legislators, to be decided by public officials. What's happened in the last number of years, and I think the ESG movement accelerated it, is this blurring of the line between the different sectors, public, private, and the nonprofit sectors. And I think also, too, is that the activists have found that they, like maybe perhaps the current administration, finds going through the laborious process of trying to get what you'd like done through the legislative channels is exceedingly frustrating, exceedingly long to do that. And even when you go through that, you may not get what you want done. And so what I think has happened is there's just been co-opting of trying to get the business community involved into issues that have been predominantly public square issues. So that did happen here, as has been pointed out, in the last number of years. I think that it's fraught with risk when you begin to move out of your lane, if you're a business person, if you're in the private sector, if you're a director, if you're in the senior management, into a domain that's been reserved for legislators and public officials. If you decide to do that, then an informed basis like Bill, you're pointing out, you better be able to tie that back into the company's strategy and its business model.
And let me just chime back in, just give you one more snippet from the opinion, because I think this is the key, right? And I want one more practical thing about it was, the court said the board's consideration of employee concerns was not at the expense of stockholders. A board may conclude in the exercise of its business judgment that addressing interests of corporate shareholders, such as the workforce that drives a company's profits, is rationally related to building long-term value. And in this particular case, the plaintiff even acknowledged that maintaining a positive relationship with employees and creative partners was crucial to the company's success. Key thing, and the key takeaways for the board is, if you're going to wade into this thicket, right, and go public on something like this, you better have a good record to defend it. Your board minutes better be, you better dot your I's and cross your T's, have a meeting, make sure you're engaged on the issue, and create the record that you're going to need to defend it if you get called on it. And I think one last practical thing about it is, because it was a political thicket, even though they won in court, what happened after that? Bob Chapek lost his job. I mean, Bob Iger came back, and in large measure, it had to do with that issue and the public outcry that it created. And Iger came back in and seemed to calm, well, put it this way, I don't know if it's totally calm, but I think calmed down a lot of the stuff that had been being thrown at Disney with respect to the special tax district.
Michael, you
Bill, I
mentioned
would just
two.
point out that you could easily have a board where you have, I'm just going to say, a number of red state directors and a number of blue state directors.
True.
I see Ann nodding her head. I take it you have such a.
No, I think you're exactly right. And I think what's happened is some of us who have been involved in this, the pendulum has swung. I think back of what corporations said on Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. I mean, the institutions waded into these, and so the backlash came. And I think, like any pendulum, it sort of swung back. But to your point, for the directors, it is sitting and thinking, okay, how does this impact our strategy of how we're making money for our shareholders in the long run? Because every institution is going to get pressure on these issues. And so how does the board make sure it is linked to the strategy? Is it important? The workforce for any company is extremely important, so you listen to them in terms of that. But there was this pendulum where all these companies spoke out on these political issues, and I think in the absence of a structure to solve public policy problems, people look to other institutions to help weigh in on those solutions.
Well, let's get the investor's perspective on this. Donna, it's often said that ESG is demanded by the investor community. They want civil rights audits or climate emissions disclosure. How do you assess that demand? Is that true? Does it vary? Are investors demanding ESG materials and ESG policies?
Okay.
Have you heard that it's often said? If you look at the SEC
I'm
climate rule,
uncomfortable with
they
the term
cite, they,
investors. That's
they
what
cite
they write.
investor demand 130 times. I counted up when I
Yes.
put in a comment letter.
Yes.
Would you agree with the SEC, or is it more complicated than that?
Let's just back up and recognize the reality that investors are behind a lot of crazy stuff in the markets. I love all the terms we're using here of boom and bust and backlash and roller coaster, and that is what this feels like. But for those of us who have been investors for a long time, it's not the first time we've seen this movie. So it takes different forms. I just want to make the point that just because investors ask for stuff, just because there was this kind of strange alchemy in 21 that Ann's referring to, where we kind of had, a lot of investor pressure, political tailwinds, there was a big shift, right, in government and some tailwinds. There was a really odd moment of a shift to employee power within organizations for kind of a lot of reasons. And managements felt kind of dragged into some of these issues by the power of their employee base and the, quiet quitting or the actual quitting that was happening then. Post-pandemic kind of societal shifts, and we didn't fully kind of have a proof of concept yet, right? There were certain assumptions made about ESG and its ability, in an investment context to impact performance. My view is it is safe to call 2021 in an investment context peak ESG, at least the version that we're talking about now. And a lot of those things, have really changed pretty quickly since then. So yes, Larry, you can put the blame on us. We probably did ask for a lot of this stuff. But I mean the royal we there, definitely not all investors, but I just also want to say that just because investors ask for stuff or want you to do stuff, our track record is not great when it comes to fueling manias, staying at the party a little too long, allocating capital irrationally. I'm just we maybe should have all been just a little bit more sort of focused on actual drivers of the business throughout this period, and then we wouldn't be experiencing this roller coaster that we are now.
Do you share my concern that the phrase investor is it's not monolithic? There are a lot of different investment strategies, styles, time horizons. There are stock pickers like T. Rowe Price. There are indexers like a lot of the market. There are long-term holders, short-term holders, arbitrage holders. So the idea of investor demand just seems an abstraction that isn't very, very useful. Do you agree with that?
I think, so if we take, between, before 2021, when some of this stuff was building, let's also kind of look back and see what else was happening in the market. A huge concentration of flows and assets into a very few hands. So you're right, kind of back in the day, you couldn't really say investors want this because they were equally allocated. There were 20 big investors all about the same size. It's not like that anymore. So shall we say, some of this was in reaction to companies realizing that their shareholder base was a lot more concentrated, and they assigned a lot of weight to the views of those firms.
Can I ask you another question? With that vision of the peak of 2021 of ESG, or at least the investor appetite, is that certainly an accurate picture of the United States situation? Is it similar in other geographies, Canada, Europe, Japan? Or does it differ across
California?
the globe? Oh, that's a different country altogether, yeah. You have a view on that?
We've been up here an hour and I haven't checked my phone, so honestly, everything could have changed in the last hour since I last read the journal, so I don't know, you guys tell me. The foundation to me does appear to be crumbling in more jurisdictions than here.
Yeah, I think so too. It was funny earlier, Michael Arnold said Europe is ahead of the U.S. and
Yeah,
always-
it all
always
depends your
smile.
perspective, right?
It's regressive. But speaking of California, let's turn to Mary Francis, whose headquarters, or whose company has been headquartered in that state for a long time until recently. But so you're in the middle of a lot of this stuff. She's in the general counsel's office of a major corporation. What are your directors? What does your board say to you? Is it concerned about the lanes, the role of business in society, and some of these other challenges? What are you hearing from your directors?
Yeah.
If you can share that kind of
Sure,
information.
sure. It is and has been for a while an active conversation how to navigate all of the changing factors in ESG and how, including the different jurisdictions where that present issues. So I'd say the main focus is governance. How do we, as a board, what is our role? They don't ask us to answer that for them. But they do want that discussion to happen. So how, for example, climate, what is the board's role in overseeing climate reporting, given that it's taking different forms around the world, and not in financial statements yet. But so that's been a very alive discussion. And once that kind of framework is set for now, I mean, these things could change, so I wouldn't ever call this a one and done. They want to know that this translates and trickles in through committee charters and management structures to enable the data gathering, the assurance that goes around that, reflecting in risk factors, the whole kind of ecosystem around governance. That's been their main focus.
And how do you advise them? Ann mentioned the sense of a pendulum swinging back and forth, and I detect some anxiety among directors about their ability not just to sort of respond to what's happening, but then to think long term. How do you handle that part of this problem?
Yeah, the long term is the key, and as we've heard previously, anchored to the business objectives and the business strategy. It's really, and this is where the general counsel's office plays a really important role, because anyone who's inside a company knows that different groups within the company get really eager and zealous to do what they're meant to do, whether it's communicating, being a good social partner. The law department knows well that people can get out of the lanes and create legal risk by how they talk about those activities. So, sorry, now I lost the kernel of your question.
I'm really going at best
Yeah.
practices, recommendations for best practices
Yeah.
for directors to handle this kind of pendulum, this
So,
whiplash.
just to kind of illustrate the fact of the pendulum, we're in proxy season now, and I think as a reflection of the very recent climate, we have only 4 proposals that we're looking at going into our proxy, down from way over a dozen, which is typical. 2 of the 4 are anti-ESG ones, asking us to disavow any climate emissions ambitions. And one is to do essentially a stranded asset analysis, assuming that our green energy investments will be stranded uneconomic assets. What's the impact on our balance sheet of that? So this is the climate, literally the climate we're in right now. And so taking, whether it's investing in green energy, whether it's how you talk about D&I, diversity, your kind of approach on those issues, taking a long view and honoring your director duties. Who are our stakeholders? What is in the long-term interest of our stockholders? Employees are key constituencies. Our customers are key constituencies. But just that's what don't be tempted to chase the latest fad, because that's fraught with misgivings, I think.
Can you give us a little more color just on the process of receiving, evaluating, handling, responding to a shareholder proposal? The board is supposed to make the assessment, make the recommendation. I don't know to what degree they're actually doing drafting or debating. Can you, without disclosing secrets, describe best practices around how to handle it, how to administer that?
Sure. So we have a window of time, not really a window. We have a deadline for getting them. That was, for us, it was in December. Our board next meets after that deadline in January. So the expectation is we will have kind of processed the shareholder proposals, meaning we'll evaluate them for, can we exclude them? Are there deficiencies? Look at a recommended approach that the board ought to consider, largely based on previous responses, because many of these are just repeat proposals. So we know the board position from last year or earlier, but kind of aligned with how we expect our board to react to this. We will pre-draft proposed responses and then have that discussion at the January board meeting. We do get feedback. We get from high level. In the past, we've been a little more, you might say, defensive, where a proponent might call out, or the proposal itself, the supporting statement, has lots and lots of factual misstatements and inflammatory rhetoric. In the past, we might take the bait a little more and respond in kind. The board has instructed us, take the high road, just stick to the facts, let the investor, voter see for themselves what the two sides of the argument are. So they care. It is their signature on it. It is the board response. But
We use committees at all, or does it go straight to the full board?
we do use committees, and then it goes to the full board. We use two committees. We have Nom and Gov, and then a Public Policy and Sustainability Committee. And given that increasingly the proposals are focused more on kind of the sustainability than the true governance, we have both of those committees meet in joint session to review them, to discuss in more tactical detail the proposed response, and then these get recommended to the full board for kind of approval for going to the proxy.
Yeah, I might point out that the SEC sort of turned this all over yesterday by issuing new guidance. I don't know, Michael, you may want to
Yeah,
explain to people what happened.
One of the reasons that Mary was dealing with dozens of shareholder proposals was because SLAB 14L, Staff Legal Bulletin 14L, which was introduced at the beginning of the Gensler administration in the SEC, basically significantly curtailed the ability of companies to go to the SEC to get exemptive relief to exclude the proposals from the proxy statement. There are various grounds on which you can exclude a proposal from the proxy statement. You know, sometimes it has too many words. There's sort of procedural ones. You know, it's too micromanaging. It lacks economic relevance to the business. You know, historically, the analysis required some sort of showing that the subject matter of the proposal, particularly in the ESG space, was relevant to the company in particular. That was done away with, and now, as of, 24 hours ago, maybe 36 hours ago, it's back. So, we're back to the quote-unquote good old days of, from a company perspective, of analyzing these shareholder proposals. Is this actually sort of tailored and specific enough to our company? Is this something that's really relevant to us versus just being at a high level an issue of social significance that, applies equally to all companies?
And that should
And
be
John-
symmetrical too, right? In the
Correct.
same way
Yeah.
that Disney's got to cut both ways, this should
Yeah.
cut both ways. So all these
But this is happening mid-season, just
Yeah.
mid-
Yeah, it's too
mid-
late to-
ju-
it's too late
just
to
the-
use this
And you may
for
have
most
red state
companies.
and blue state directors
Yeah.
on your.
Yep.
If I
I'm
could
sorry,
just
Don,
give you
on that.
I'll just give you a stat for a sense of a sense of impact on this. From that 2021 date to year-end 2024, the volume in our portfolios of E&S-related proposals increased 60%. So it wasn't like, we got a few more. It was.
It was huge.
So the burden on investors and asset managers to vote these things is enormous. But just you think of for those of you who are directors, you mentioned, so two committees and a board. These are not rubber stamp topics. They get a lot of airtime in the precious resource of time for the board.
Yeah, and that process, I'd love to get Michael's and Ann's view on that. And is the process, the internal process, different for ESG-type proposals than typical business-type proposals? Does it get heightened attention of some kind?
If you're careful, you shouldn't. I don't think it should take up an inordinate amount of time because another perennial tension, besides, the demarcation of responsibilities between the directors and management, is how much time do you spend on the business growth, value creation versus governance matters? And what's been happening, I guess, over the last number of years, and the ESG issue has exacerbated, is that companies and directors, management teams find themselves spending more of that precious, limited time on governance issues at the expense of spending most of the time on value creation. Fundamentally, there is nothing necessarily wrong with the issue of the term, the term that's used, sustainability, in the sense that true sustainability for all constituencies, meaning the company, investors, and employees, and then communities and so forth, is if you, at the very beginning upstream, create enough value to sustain all those constituencies. So, in my view, to the question you're posing, we shouldn't be spending more, an inordinate time on the issue, say, as we do with other risk matters, at the expense of making sure that we have our laser focus on value creation.
But the system has imposed that price. I mean, you can't ignore this challenge, right?
I don't disagree, but this is where directors have to take the long view, I think.
And also push back a little, right? Does the NACD have a role to play in assuring that there is plenty of room for strategy and leadership and traditional roles rather than just compliance and governance?
And I think that that particular message is becoming one that's been out there a little bit more and more, to say, wait a second, yes, governance issues are important, no doubt, and making sure that you're paying attention to your ERM process that's you use as your tool to exercise oversight on risk management, but careful not to do this at the expense of spending that very precious time that you have on value creation.
Ann, do you care to comment
Well,
on?
to answer your question, I think the process for any shareholder proposal should be the same. You may spend more time on details of trying to explain what it is, but many of the shareholder, the company-sponsored ones, for stock or whatever, the equity issues or something, but before the E&S, you had a lot of governance proposals. And I think, and I'd have to ask Mary and Donna on both of these, who've been, a lot of the governance issues were, okay, are these evolving standards that many of your shareholders want changes in governance? Whether it be, an independent chair or majority vote standard, some of the basic governance issues. So I think the boards had to deal with those before we got into and those were evolving standards that private ordering resulted in changes in market norms. And that came about through many shareholder proposals. Then we got into when, a lot of these E&S and Donna's right, the very detailed ones in terms of this. And then it was like, okay, you won that, what do we do next time and all that. But to answer your question, the process for looking at shareholder proposals, I think from the board's perspective, should be the same, whether, whatever the issue is of the shareholder proposal.
Can I ask you two directors a question about the coming period? A lot of changes are coming. A couple have already been made, I guess, and we can see which direction they're heading. Should directors welcome this? Is this going to help corporate governance? Is it going to help your jobs? Or is it indifferent? Does it hurt?
Well, the question, I think, gets to the issue that I think have already been raised about the variability that is embedded with some of these issues. That one day it's this way, and then another day you swing the pendulum and it's the other way. The inbox for directors and management teams from a financial economic value creation point of view, because there's variability and cyclicality in that, is intense enough already without having to then deal with sort of knee-jerk responses to the way the winds are blowing, the political winds are blowing in Washington, D.C. So it's another reason for saying careful to sort of wade into a lane that you're not really, that you're really not expected to spend a whole heck of a lot of time in, and instead maintain your focus on what you're supposed to be doing. So I would say that, we're seeing this course correction, which I think is expected because of the cyclicality or the variability that happens with political issues. And it's another reason why directors need, I think, to look over the horizon around the bend and sort of anticipate that, okay, it's this way for now. There's probably a high degree of probability that it may swing a different way. So be careful, make maybe perhaps no regrets decisions, but be careful not to get into issues where you're knee-jerking your responses to the flavor of the day.
So let me answer it a little bit of a different way in terms of people like Donna are the people who give companies like mine the capital to do the job that we have to do. So if we're doing something that her portfolio manager, they don't think is appropriate, or that, we've made a bad decision, it's important for us to hear from our large investors, because they're the ones who give us the money to actually do the job of running the company. So I think it's important for companies to engage with shareholders. So the discussion, are these changes good? Well, to the extent they may impede the free flow of discussion and engagement with our shareholders, that is a problem, because then the only mechanism they have is to vote no on the proxy, and that's a pretty blunt instrument. And then you don't necessarily, why did you vote no? What were the issues? Because it's sort of a binary decision. So I am a big believer in terms of the engagement with your shareholders. They're always these shareholders, and I can go back into history in terms of some of the issues of shareholders and the issues that they get involved in that are far afield. But at the end of the day, to me as a director, all of our shareholders, and some of our larger ones that we deal with regularly, it's important for us to hear the issues that they feel we're doing well or not handling correctly.
Right, so I guess each rule has to be taken on its own terms. You're referring to a rule that will potentially have a chilling effect on investors' willingness to engage and to share information and knowledge, and we have to take them one at a time, right? Because the shareholder proposal rule restrictions will probably have a different effect on the boardroom. It's going to cut down the number of proposals that boards need to worry about. But on investor engagement, it's a new phenomenon in the last 15 or 20 years that, investors have always talked to the CEO and the CIO or the CFO. It's a relatively new thing to be sitting with directors. Do you guys, have you done that? Have you sat down and talked to your investors as directors? Are you doing that?
I have.
Yeah.
I haven't.
What is it like? Ann, can you give us a sense of
Well, a
what
lot
is
of
the
it's in
preparation? What's the dynamic?
In the listening mode in terms of, how the decisions we've made, the performance of the stock, if we have some issues, talking to them about strategy and how we're trying to turn things around. So I think it all depends on the issue. I think the advent of, say, on pay drove more engagement with boards because of the compensation. And when I was on the shareholder side, it's a little hard to talk to the CEO or the head of HR about how you oppose their pay, because they're going to do nothing but defend it. So I felt a necessity to have an engagement with the compensation committee about, tell us your thinking of why you structured the pay like you did. This is a concern. We think it could be. So I do think over the last, when did that come in? Dodd-Frank,
2010,
so,
yeah.
So I think that has driven more engagement. And I think there is more of an expectations on the part of investors to be able to chat with directors about making sure that the message is getting through. I think most investors are happy to talk to management on issues, but there may be times that it necessitates talking to a director.
Yeah,
Maybe
that was
just
the catalyst.
If I could build on that, because I don't want to give you the impression that I haven't engaged with a shareholder, that it's not that we don't want to. It's that, again, it just depends on the company situation and also the investors' preferences. So if investors don't feel the need to go beyond management to get what they want, then there's no necessarily a reason, per se, to say, okay, well, I'll reach out to you and talk to you anyway. But in the boards that I'm on, that I have been on, that option for investors to talk to a director, to talk particularly to a chair of a particular committee, is always open.
Yep. You do have to be careful, though, in those conversations not to disclose material, non-public information under Regulation FD.
Absolutely.
And I just wonder, Mary, do you Do your directors talk to investors, and do you or somebody in the general counsel's office need to participate or train the director in that boundary? How does that work?
Both. We've not been asked by investors to speak only with directors with no management in the room. I'm the corporate secretary. I think they generally feel safe with me in the room, that they can have a candid discussion with a director. But we, every year, have at least our lead director, but often, or at times, head of audit or head of comp committees. And they know the rules on FD, but we do remind them of those, those limitations.
Excellent.
So, Larry, having done this for, this is our fourth version. I always like being the timekeeper, and I'm looking at, we're coming
right
up
on time.
Well, we're coming up
So
on 3:30.
One of his other innovations, can I brag about your other innovation? Or do you want to brag about your innovation, or do you want me to?
I don't know what the
The innovation
Depends
is
on what
we
it is.
will welcome
Yeah.
your questions. The Weinberg Center and this panel, this program in particular, is famous for high-quality audience questions and engagement. So we've got and his innovation was to take a break before the Q&A so you can distill and develop excellent questions. So he's nudging me to say, let's take a bio break, a coffee break. We'll come back in 15 minutes.
Yeah, we'll come back at
We'll come back at
3:45.
3:45, and then,
But we've got 20 minutes or so set aside for questions from you. I've actually got a couple of good questions, but I will hold them back if we can get questions from you. And you'll see the same group up here for 20 minutes or so to take your questions on the topics we've covered.
we look forward to your questions, and thank you, panel, very much for this entertaining discussion.
I have no problem asking
And do
questions.
you mind saying your name and affiliation if you wish?
Sure.
so-
Matt DiGiuseppe, I'm with PwC's Governance Insight Center. One of the interesting things about boom versus bust, boom is an additive period. Bust can be kind of not, I don't want to say removal, but a shifting period. For directors, when they think about sort of changing policies related to ESG topics, to move away from a position. So Mary, I know you said like on DEI, you've always had principles. But if you want to change your principles as an organization and move away from something that you had adopted previously, what should directors be thinking about in that context to sort of set them up to make that hard fork, if you will, in response to the climate?
And that question is posed to Mary, and while she's thinking, I'll
No,
just-
I was posing
it was
that
to the
generally.
director.
You know,
I'm gonna
since
call
Michael
on-
said he knows my name,
I'm going to call
I'll pose it to
on
him.
Mary and Ann, but I also want to recognize that Matt is also a member of the Weinberg Center Advisory Board, for which we thank you very much.
And always willing to stand up.
Excellent. So, Mary,
Okay.
take it away.
If I'm
Phone a
wearing my
friend.
director hat, which I don't have, what should they be thinking if you make a hard pivot on kind of a core value? I think that has to be very, very thoughtfully considered and informed, and with a long-term view, and it ought to be supported by what's not working. At some point, you made that decision you're pivoting from. What are the different circumstances that are counseling you or leading you to choose a different direction? I mean, it just has to be decision quality has to be there, because it'll be picked up in the press, your employees, there's going to be some ambiguity and just some, what are we doing? Have we lost our North Star? Depending on what the matter is. So there is a whole lot of stakeholder interest in your core principles that need to be well considered, and a good engagement program thought out in advance.
Yeah, I would agree with that from a director perspective. It's all, corporate governance, all about process. What's your process for changing that? How did you get there? Socialize the changes. Who's the impact? What's the rationale for the change? Make sure it's a business reason for the rationale for the change. I think has been said, I think what a lot of companies now are going through, what they say on DEI, they're not moving away from the value of good to have diversity and inclusion, but what's the narrative? How have we portrayed it in the past? Could it be misconstrued as something that it's not? And so taking kind of a fine-tooth comb to what has been said. But I think it's a process if you're going to do a wholesale change away from something, and socialize that and the pros and cons.
Yeah, I just think, and again, from a Delaware perspective, make sure the board is engaged on the issue. Don't let management drive the train on this. It's something that fundamental that's changing a core value at the company of some ilk. Make a record on it, right? I mean, the board should be framing the issue around how does this promote the long-term value of the company for the benefit of its stockholders, and is it in the company's best interest to do it? And, you know, evaluate the pros and cons, and you got to weigh those things and document it, because if it's going to hit the press, shareholders are going to ask for those books and records, and you better have them. Otherwise, you're going to get sued, and you're not going to be able to defend yourself very well without a good record.
Yeah, and I think learning from experience is worthwhile, right? I mean, when everybody rushed headlong into kind of making ESG commitments without thinking about, like, okay, what is the long term, you know, all right, we need to put out a scope 3 goal. Oh, wait, you know, the cost of the offsets that we would need to buy run into like the billions of dollars. You know, those are the sorts of things that weren't done in 2021, and I think companies generally realize the risk of that, so I think they are doing a better job now of looking before they leap, and, you know, as they walk back and change perspectives, I think they're doing a better job.
Good question, good answers. We'll alternate between the microphones, and this is Dante Pavin. Hi, Dante.
Hi, how are you?
Good to see you. Well,
Glad to be here.
He's one of our Myron T. Steele Fellows this year. Let's give a hand for Dante. Dante, thank you very much.
I had a question about what you think in the current landscape about how this trajectory will impact public benefit corporations, if you'll see more of them, if you'll see less of them, or how institutional investors might approach them as well, as maybe a more surefire bet of stability in the ESG landscape.
Brilliant question. I'll pick on people unless Donna probably has a good answer.
Well, the best data point I've heard on that recently is, I mean, honestly, I think of, is this impolite to say in Delaware? I think of PBCs, it was a little bit of a fluffy category. It was kind of a strange mix of companies and reasons for wanting that structure. In our view, a lot of open legal questions around it. But a data point I've heard recently is that AI companies are registering under that structure, not because of the fluffy ESG reasons, but because of their perception that they do have a social mission and that they have a very long-term point of view and protection from shareholders, that's the best vehicle for them for those kind of purposes, which I wouldn't exactly call what we envision PBCs to be about. Is that true?
No, I think it is true, and I think if you follow the OpenAI saga that is ongoing even today and yesterday with the launch of a hostile bid, you know, OpenAI has been talking about a conversion that in part would create a public benefit corporation as part of their structure. So it is very relevant to that, particularly to that industry right now.
Excellent question. My own crystal ball is it's going to make that a much more attractive alternative business organization. That'd be my guess. Back to the other microphone on the other side of the room. Could you say who your name as well?
Sure. Yes, so I'm Julie Anderson. I spent 30 years in finance with Donna at T. Rowe Price, but also PIMCO Invesco, and then was at the helm at BlackRock during the fall. So starting in 2022 when everything kind of went down, as we know. And now I'm at American University. I'm faculty there. So I'm really curious about the concept of financial materiality, and in particular, what the dialogue is going on at the board of directors level. So Donna and I share the view that what is financially material is difficult to determine when it comes to ESG because it's backward-looking, and these things weren't material historically. So I'm curious how much a board discussion, when you're discussing ESG or sustainability issues, is reactionary to what's happening, because that's what it sounds like, what's going on in politics, the pushback, the boom and the bust, versus proactive in business strategy, helping the management team understand what is or will be in the future financially material to them with these non-financial factors. What is the dialogue like? I'm curious at the board level, reactionary versus strategy, which was mentioned by Michael many times.
Sounds like one for Ann and Mike. Ann, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just sort of foot stomp what we had said a little earlier, that in the boardroom, directors should try to avoid being reactionary and not to be sort of knee-jerking their responses to what's happening politically, particularly politically. The issue, this particular topic, it is about materiality. I'm glad you pointed that out, especially when, and I chair an audit committee, and I've been doing that for some time. It is about making sure that if we're going to spend very precious time in that boardroom on a particular topic, it has to have some level of materiality attached to that. So doing the assessments appropriately, and if there is materiality, then in fact extending that into doing scenario analysis, to do stress tests, to see what the impact is going to be on the business. But I think it has to start with having a determination that what's facing potentially the company is something that indeed is material.
Ann?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, because I think being reactionary by its very nature, you know, if it was material, it should have already sort of bubbled up in terms of, you know, material financial. Now, there may be, like I'm on a retail company, so supply chain is a very serious issue to us, and we produce overseas, so we want to make sure our supply chain and the labor standards that they follow. Now, some people would say those are ESG issues in terms of labor, but they are financially material to us, because if you recall back to the Nike days, it became very problematic in terms of their supply chain practices. So those issues are, most of the issues, at least the companies that I've been involved with, are very financially material that we are actively watching and seeing, not being reactionary.
Okay, Larry, it's going to get good. Peggy Ferran has
I was
asked.
going to say, wait.
Oh, we got to go over here first.
We got some
Okay.
tough
Gotta
ones over
alternate,
this
yeah.
side.
All right.
Oh, you want the easy ones or the tough ones?
Easy ones,
Let's keep
please.
alternating.
Hi, my name is Fiona Kaufman. I'm with EY and the Center for Board Matters. My question is around, there was the discussion about separating the private sector from the public sphere, the public square, and that being an important ideal, that we keep that separation. But I just struggle to square it with the Citizens United ruling world that we're in, which, you know, in a way does make corporations political actors. And so, I just worry that could we end up in a, getting kind of worst of both worlds, where corporations are political actors and they're kind of, competing for political power, but also they're doing it solely on business interests, and we don't get to hear what their views are. So I'm just wondering about squaring that kind of, corporations stay out of the public square, but at the same time, you can also have an impact on politics.
Michael, she might be directing that to you, since you brought up that distinction, but.
Yeah. In stating what I had mentioned earlier about that, I don't want to give you the impression that it's exclusive, that it's a hard line, because the business community, the private sector has always had sort of a foot into the public domain by trying to influence policy that's favorable to businesses, right? I mean, through donations and so forth, supporting particular candidates that are supportive of the kinds of things that, or issues that they are interested in. So I don't want to convey that it's that much of a sort of binary thing. I guess what I was really trying to get at is that that business leaders don't necessarily have to feel like they have to wade into the thicket of public issues unless what's being debated indeed has a direct impact on the business model, the strategy of the organization. And in other words, there's actually a vested interest. Some of these issues, like the ESG area, for instance, particularly when it comes to climate, when it comes to societal kinds of things. The remit is very broad. It impacts not just that specific company, but all the citizens of the country. And when God was, sort of picking out exactly how the sectors would be constructed, that he assigned that to legislators and public officials. And she did as well, by the way.
I will say, one other issue that comes up in this context all the time, and I don't have the answers on this, but just to raise it as another kind of potentially problematic area is, the role of trade associations. Especially in the kind of ESG boom phase, there was a retreat to using trade associations to say things that individual companies didn't feel like they could. And similarly, there were, shareholder proposals asking for a breakdown of your contribution to these trade associations or whatever in order to kind of, paint them with a brush about that they were not really fulfilling their ESG commitments. It's a really tricky issue, and I think one that, the takeaway is, to return to a familiar topic, is, from a director's perspective, be mindful of why you're doing these different things. Why are we, making contributions to these trades versus that? How are we using them, and doing the best you can to avail yourself of the business judgment rule when you do it.
Well, now, John, I think you're right to recognize our good friend
Well, I don't know,
Peggy Foran, who is,
Peggy is.
oh, is she?
Peggy's back in the,
We're gonna
Peggy's
have
had a
to
question at
just
every single program we've done.
Keep everyone in
so
suspense.
Well, so Colleen Davis, Delaware State Treasurer. My question is sort of around that, again, that sort of blurred line between the public and private sector, and how those regulatory transitions end up having an impact. And I'm really thinking about this from the EPA's perspective. There are a number of regulations that affect our energy sector that are sort of coming in line over the next several months to a couple of years. And just, again, I thinking about how policy and the political whim impacts what you're doing, and what those, I would say the gravity of the risk from a corporate perspective. It can fluctuate, and some of those dollars change, and that's one of the things I think about, is really the how it hits you financially, and again, that sort of long-term trajectory on returns versus risk and the fiduciary responsibility. So how do you sort of get to that space, that happy space where you're sort of you're justifying what you're doing, and you're also ensuring that you're complying with your vision from a corporation perspective, looking to support the vision of why so many folks are investing in you, as well as other stakeholders, and that political gray area that comes into play.
Maybe I can start, since you mentioned the energy industry. I think it's important that regulators have a good information set on which to regulate, and they understand the impacts. And sometimes the regulators are not experts in the field they are regulating.
No.
So if I can venture to say that.
Write that one down as one of the takeaways. That's a good one.
Can you get $500
that's
for that?
how we kind of view it. It's we want to make this impact. You see, particularly in the energy space, the efforts to extinguish fossil fuels, and then we get called out, well, why aren't you producing more? The prices are too high. And it's kind of, so we kind of try to contribute to the dialogue of sensible energy policy.
Right. Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind, and it's related to a question that Mike Pittenger, who's in the audience, asked me, is, a corporation doesn't want to become a law violator either, right? So if there are new regulations and laws that come online, if you want to avail yourself of the business judgment rule, you still have to, you have a duty to comply with the law. So you have to be aware of that and monitor the changes. And Mike particularly put a hard question to me of, well, what happens if you have a red state and a blue state, and you have conflicting environmental laws, for example? In one state, you're in a blue state, at your headquarters in a blue state, you want to follow blue state law, but you do some business in the red state too, and you can't divide yourself that way. And what do you do? And I don't know that there's a great answer to that, other than to say, you may not be in business judgment land if you're violating the positive law, and you have to be careful and be wary of that.
I am really glad we brought up the issue of energy, because what gets, I think, lost in the entire debate about this topic is the second, third order consequences with respect to how energy policy impacts national security. So the one thing that you, at least I think, that you don't want to do is give your adversaries, AKA China, the ability to have greater leverage in the energy space than we do, we being the U.S. and the West. So I've been very sensitive to this topic from the time it was introduced, because China has been taking advantage of the whole green revolution for a host of reasons. They happen also to produce some of the products that are involved in green options and so forth, and they're happy to provide all that because that's what the U.S. and the West have been, at least lately over the last number of years, have gravitated towards, but at the expense of having reliable energy sources when you need it to confront an adversary as dominant as China. So when we talk about this particular space, at least for me, but I am mentioning it to all of you, not to be ignorant of the fact that this has a much wider and broader aspect to it than just reducing carbon emissions.
Transcendent point. Mindful of time, because we need to move to the next panel, let's make these our two final questions. First from Peggy Foran, also
Sure.
a Weinberg Center Advisory Board member.
All right.
Yeah, no,
Peggy.
thank you so much. And again, I think I've been to all four, and this has been fabulous. But I'm Peggy Foran. I'm the Chief Governance Officer and Corporate Secretary at Prudential Financial, and I have been and I am on a public board. So first a comment and then a prediction from this fabulous panel. The comment on DEI, I don't really think boards are changing policy. I think what they are doing is, in light of what is going on, they still have their North Star. I mean, it's critical for them to recruit the right people for the jobs. But they're not going out, they're changing their language. I guess that's the best way to put it. You know, some of the bespoke programs that we have in the diversity area, we've had to change those legally because, you know, after the college cases, we figured we're going to be the next. So instead of saying, you know, this internship is for 10, you know, you name it, green people, it's open to everyone. So those are the types of things that have changed. But at least from the corporate secretaries and general counsels, and Mary, you can confirm I'm talking to, that there's not really major changes in policy. I also do a lot of engagement, and Donna, maybe you can confirm. It's like 0 in the US this year on climate. Like, you know, in prior years, they all wanted us to talk about what are you doing, even though in various issues, it's probably not very material to us, but they still wanted to talk about it. They wanted us to talk about it. I'm hearing very little, very, very little on that, except from some of our UK investors and European, and even they are probably not asking quite as many questions. They're still asking it. But my prediction is I worked a lot with Paul Atkins. I've heard him speak many times. I have a lot of respect for him. I've seen this amazing change, or some people say it's amazing. Some people, I'm sure, will use other words for that in just a short period of time. So knowing Paul, knowing the issues he's brought up on our panel, knowing the issues he's brought up when he was on the SEC before, knowing the issues that, you know, if you go to these various conferences that he brings up, you know, give me the top 3 things that you think are going to be different in a year or 2 years.
Well, can I
Go ahead.
Yes.
start with all due respect, disagreeing with Peggy on the first point? I think pushback on DEI, and DEI is just one example. What's the phrase? They've been pushing on an open door. We see companies absolutely changing on a principle kind of level, and it takes a feather to get them to do it. One call from Robbie Staubach or they already wanted to do it, and they are happy to go there. I don't think it's language. And then to the second point, I mean, about what will investors be engaging with, honestly, after this week, you might not have investors engaging about climate or anything else. I think we should emphasize how seismic the activity this week, already is.
Yeah, could you talk about that just a little bit? I was going to ask this question anyway, even though I'm not there but here. But obviously there was or SEC action, which is going to seemingly dampen engagement. I don't know, Michael, can you just, in one sentence, explain what it is, and then I want Donna to explain what's going to happen.
Yeah, so the very short version is if you own a 5% stake in a public company, you have to make certain disclosures. Those disclosures could be either on a 13D, if you're trying to exercise control over that issuer. So if you're an activist, is sort of the prototypical 13D filer, and that requires a lot of information. You can also file a 13G, which doesn't require very much information. That's sort of the prototypical passive investors file 13Gs. What changed over the last couple days is certain kind of shareholder engagement activities that we thought would not disqualify you from using the easy form, the 13G form, may actually push you into the 13D form. So there's your background. Now Donna could say, from the investor perspective, what that really means.
Well, it's way too soon. I mean, nobody wants to make any predictions yet, but I'm just saying, I don't think you have to worry about your phone ringing, too much this year.
Let's take one more question, then we really have to move on to the next panel, right, John?
Yes, we'll figure out, maybe the panelists should start switching up. I don't know what your question is. I don't know who to answer it, but we'll be ready.
Hi, my name is Deason Huang Albrecht. I'm an accounting professor at Rutgers from New Jersey, and I do ESG disclosure-related research. So thank you for this wonderful panel and for letting me come. So my question is, historically, when you look at this ESG backlash, were the state legislators, were they reactionary or proactive in this? When we heard about the red states with the anti-ESG laws, before that, on the ground, did you already have this public sentiment or this chatter that preceded or maybe presaged, the legislative action?
I'll take that. No, I think it was reactionary for the most part. I think there's also, this is a much bigger conversation, but in the, on the right of center aisle, the right of the aisle in the political space, there are different perspectives on the views of corporate power, big companies, et cetera. I think that the cleavage between, the more populist and the more traditional, conservative movements also played a huge role in the fact that these are now sort of active, topics of consideration. And for the most part, the red state backlash to ESG was almost entirely reactionary as opposed to something that was dormant and then activated in the last year, at least in my view.
We're going to switch panels now. John, how do you do this?
Well, first of all, Donna should not take both name tags. Just take, Donna, there's one under, you need to, underneath your name, you have to there's another one put back. We are changing panels.
While we're doing the change of panels, I have a public service announcement for the lawyers in the room who are seeking continuing legal education credit. Please be sure to fill out the form at the registration table. We have 2.5 for Delaware, I think, and 2.7 for Pennsylvania. Happy to give it to you, but you do need to fill out a form. And Nicole Rich, my colleague, will help you if you need it. And so I've absorbed plenty of minutes there. And John, I'll turn it over to you to lead the discussion on reporting.
All right, well, so if you happen to notice, we now have filled the middle of the dais here with accountants.
John couldn't be more excited.
Well, we have to get practical at some point, right? So accountants tend to be quite practical. So I'm going to start with Paul Beswick. Paul was the chief accountant at the SEC, which is like the most important accountant in the country and in the world. He did that for a while. He's now the chief accountant at EY, one of the big four. And the other thing I've noticed is whenever I hang around with accountants is they actually spend more time in the boardroom than corporate lawyers do because they're there all the time, at least with audit committees. But they spend a lot of time in the boardroom. So, Paul, maybe I should ask you to, maybe I'll just make it open-ended. What is your reaction to all you're hearing up here? I'll just let you talk a little bit.
Sure. I'm not surprised. I mean, you saw this coming, and I think some people are talking about like the swiftness of what happened in this last week. I think everything that's been done to date is entirely expected by people who are following this. I don't think there's anything that is a surprise right now. And I mean, you can see, if you're just looking at the commission, we'll talk about the commission for a minute, it was quick and it was sudden. But this happens. This is not new in terms of having, changes between administrations. I mean, we saw this the last time when, the Democrats won with Biden. You saw a lot of actions happen very quickly. Michael talked about, Acting Chair Ueda wanting to be careful. There is a lot they can do from a staff perspective, and that should not get lost on anybody. What you will see is a change in approach from Corp Fin. You will see that fairly quickly. They have control of the staff and can make directions on how they, institute the Corp Fin review process. And so under Chair Gensler, there was a very active and very focused, review process where they were focusing on ESG matters, and some would say expanding the boundary of what was material and what you had to ask questions over. I'm suspecting that is going to dry up pretty quickly. And so you're going to see a bunch of like personnel and staffing changes in the execution of the commission, but not trying to do anything that's going to get, Paul Atkins in trouble on a confirmation approach. I mean, they're going to try to limit that so that, he doesn't have to answer questions on those. But, I was at the commission with John, and, I had been in Paul's office and was there with Hester and Mark Ueda, and, I think they are very aligned. And so I think they're taking a lot of steps behind the scenes. The statement by Acting Chair Ueda is interesting in terms of the climate rule, and I think Michael did a nice job outlining what could happen. There are some really interesting things they're going to have to do because they can't just pull it. Like, that's the one thing we know is they just can't pull it.
Because they don't have authority. You need to go through a rulemaking.
You have to go through a rulemaking, and then you have to justify it, and you're going to have, Commissioner Crenshaw sitting there going, well, no, we did consider that. You're saying we didn't, but we did. And it's going to create tension. And so, how they get out of this in terms of the next steps will be fascinating to watch.
But they will get out of it, as Michael said.
They will find a way to change the requirement. Now, what they could do is, people didn't maybe pick up on this, but when Chair Clayton was leaving in his last days of his administration, they passed a human capital disclosure requirement. And it was very principles-based. It was based on materiality and had no required metrics in it. That rulemaking made it very challenging for Chair Gensler to actually move forward with a human capital disclosure because he now had to say what didn't work under this one, and they were having trouble finding ways to justify it. That's why if you look at the regulatory agenda for the SEC on human capital, it just kept getting bumped. It kept getting bumped because they couldn't figure out how to justify it. And, Chair Clayton's human capital disclosures is still sitting there. And so they're going to try to figure a way out to leave it that way so it's harder for a future commission to do rulemaking on it.
So I guess the principal way that many of us are advising boards today in this space is the SEC rule, the new final SEC rule, which has not gone effective yet, certainly isn't going to go effective in its present form and probably won't go effective in any form, but in any event. But that's not the end of the story, because there are other places like California and Europe and so on that are out there. So, I mean, that's kind of the principal advice we're giving in this space. Can you talk a little bit about California?
Yeah, I'll talk about both, but let me make a sort of overarching comment, and this is what at least I'm telling audit committees when I meet with them, and is at a minimum, you're doing voluntary disclosures right now. And what that looked like 4 years ago was all over the board in terms of responsibility and who was doing it. I mean, I talked to some companies, and I'm not kidding, 5 years ago, investor relations was preparing the report on sustainability. And if we've learned nothing, let's imagine a world where all of this goes away in terms of the required reporting, and the world is voluntary reporting is the only thing that's left. I think we've learned some valuable lessons about, making sure that you've got good processes and controls around this, and having the finance function at least involved, because the finance function is really good about processes and controls and repeatability and accuracy. And I think boards have come to the realization that that's really, really important. So that's sort of the overarching. Regarding California, I think Michael laid out a lot of what's going on in there. There's an interesting dynamic, though, that's going on in California. So when California passed the law, they tasked enforcement with a little-known organization prior to the law, which was the California Air Resource Board, which, unless you were really steeped in California law and you didn't know anything about this, they were put in charge of this. Well, they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the budget, and California has slowly, the legislature has been giving them the resources and giving them the budget, but recently the CARB has come out and said, well, for the first year, just do your best, and we're not going to take enforcement as long as you did your best, and if it's incomplete, that's fine, just keep the records. And they said that publicly. Well, the reaction by the California legislature was, that's interesting. If you don't speed this up, we're going to call you in front of the legislature, and you're going to have to defend your actions. So you've got this situation where the enforcer is saying, wait a minute, we might need more time to get this done, and you've got the legislature going, hey, you don't have the time, you have to speed up. The other interesting dynamic that's going on with California is there are fines for non-compliance. So if you don't do the GHG, or if you don't do the risks, the one fine is $500,000, the other fine is $50,000. And there are companies going, that's a little lower than the compliance cost. So what's the economic trade-off here? Where that gets difficult, though, is New York, New Jersey, Washington, and Illinois are all in various stages of requiring this. And their requirements are very similar to California. So earlier in one of the panels, they were talking about red states, blue states. You can sort of align this. And then that economic analysis of, hey, if I just don't comply, what happens? Well, if you do that over 6, 7 states, it starts to get expensive. And so I think we are sitting back waiting to see what happens with the California case that will be moving forward.
So, Mary, we can't mention California without looking at you.
Yes.
I will just ask the open-ended question, what about California, and what are you advising your board on that front? You're obviously subject to California rules.
We are. Until January 1st, we were headquartered there. We recently moved our corporate headquarters to Texas, but we still clearly operate refineries and have many employees in California, and are subject to them if the rules, if they are upheld. So we don't plan for kind of case by case, turn by turn response to rulemaking. We see the direction of travel. We started with voluntary reporting several years ago of our emissions, and that was thoughtfully approached. What are we, for purposes of assurance and comfort with that, given we're in a climate of greenwashing claims and litigation, and so it was thoughtfully thought through whether we would do that. But if the California rules are invalidated, something's going to drive this, and we see the direction of travel. I do think California is very committed to being a leader in environmental stewardship and being a model for other jurisdictions to follow. So I think they will continue in that direction. So we're going to be prepared for that.
So before I go to our directors to comment, you just want to mention something about CSRD? I mean, we said it earlier, but just...
Yeah, maybe...
Just...
just add a little more nuance or color to what's going on in Europe. So the way laws work in the European Commission is the Commission passes a directive, and then each of the jurisdictions has to put it into law. And so CSRD is still not been put into law in 9 jurisdictions, including Germany, Spain, the Netherlands. In addition, France is now starting to push back. So there's a meeting either at the end of the month or the beginning of March, they're being really secretive, where they're going to come out with a proposal that will scale back some of the CSRD requirements. Europe they did a competitiveness study, and they figured out that their regulations was costing Europe, business growth, development opportunities. And so they have a goal of cutting the regulatory burden by 25% over some period of time. And so one of the things they're going to look at is the CSRD, CSDDD, and then the EU taxonomy. And do they scale it back? What does it look like? Change, there's sort of everything's on the table then. You change effective dates, you change requirements, you scale certain companies out. It's a complete guess in terms of what will be required. U.S. companies are not going to escape it. And so then we'll have to see whether the U.S. has, a response to that. But something's going to happen, and they're going to make it easier, but it's too hard to predict right now.
Actually, before we go to our director, Palia, let's go to you for just a second here.
Yeah.
Can you talk also about voluntary as well?
Voluntary reporting, yeah,
Because
sure.
obviously there is voluntary
Yeah, yeah.
compliant, or wrong choice of words. There's voluntary disclosures going on. Virtually like 90-some% of the larger companies have sustainability reports of some sort out there.
Right, right. So first, John, I'd like to mention that I work with the National Office of a National Size accounting firm, Con Resnick, and I lead the SEC audit practice. That's represented mostly by what we call smaller reporting companies. We currently have about 6,000 domestic registrants that file annually in 10K. Of them, approximately 50% are smaller reporting companies. Besides the low public flow that they represent, they usually have less than 500 million in revenue and usually very limited capital and human resources to deal with what we call is good for the environment, good for society, and hence voluntary ESG reporting pretty much doesn't exist among these smaller reporting companies. What their boardrooms are looking forward to is mostly the European Union sustainability reporting requirements, because when they have 500 or less annual revenue on a consolidated basis, they're more likely to trip the much lower revenue thresholds in the European Union and have to report starting 2028 under the current provisions. And so that's what they're interested in, not as much California and the other states within the US. And voluntary sustainability reporting, I'd say, really is a trend among the S&P 500. There is a Center of Audit Quality annual report on sustainability reporting, and it tracks how many of the S&P 500 do report it, how many of them obtain limited assurance or reasonable level of assurance. So truly it doesn't exist at our level, and we've been isolated from the boom and backlash on the audit side.
Okay, let's go to our directors here. You can just stop now? The SEC is finished or in pause?
Yeah, no, I think as has been said, there's been a lot of voluntary reporting even before. I'm not sure there's going to be a wholesale, U-turn and people taking all that down. I suspect the pace of adoption of voluntary reporting may slow as they look to see what happens in the landscape. But I still think it's information regardless of whether there is a mandatory aspect, a required aspect that some of their investors may want some information, and how are you handling these issues, and how do you account for these issues, that type of thing. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I would echo that, because as I was suggesting a little earlier in the first panel, this is an area that I think falls very neatly, at least I think, into the ERM framework. It's a risk that, among other risks, that certainly the audit committee in most places, some companies have risk committees, but This is an area that a committee is watching all the time, should be watching all the time, and then by extension, the board should pay its appropriate attention. What I've been trying to emphasize, however, is that it shouldn't be something that is overemphasized and spent an inordinate amount of time on it at the expense of strategy, value creation, et cetera.
I actually want to change direction just a little bit here and kind of look at this a little bit maybe from the academia standpoint. Larry, I see you nodding. I actually looked at the list of attendees and looked at how many had EDU emails, and it was close to 25% of the attendees are either, well, we're from an educational institution, and I assume most of those are students. Can we talk a little bit about what this is doing to the curriculum, to what students in business school, accounting students, should be looking at and thinking about with all of what we're talking about today? I realize this is not quite the Delaware law piece of this, but since 25% of our attendees are in that space, and we are, after all, at the University of Delaware, I thought it's worth spending a few minutes on this.
Yeah,
Kent, would you?
if I could preface this, the people on this panel are extremely bright, and they are also gainfully employed. I am a professor emeritus, so I owe no obligation to anyone. I can say whatever I want up here, and nobody's going to be offended because I have no ties. So let me make that clear. These are my opinions only. I think I took my first accounting class in 1968. And so if you think back, you can do the math. It's a long time ago. Curriculums have changed, but I would say in this particular area, there's nothing that we do specifically for an undergraduate accounting student, or as far as I know, a finance student that takes on these kinds of topics. We have so much information that have to be covered in a normal undergraduate curriculum that the kinds of things we're talking about might be covered in a senior year or maybe in a graduate program. But hopefully the things that they learn as an undergrad, they can apply to this situation. For example, I went through the research that was, I think there's 10 different articles on ESG that have been fairly recent, and I found 10 conclusions as such, and there was only one in there that really couldn't be addressed by accounting people. And the rest of them are kinds of things that we seem to have blown this, in my opinion, somewhat out of proportion, because passing this information on to third parties can be done in several ways. You can quantify it, or you can take it in a footnote or whatever and tell a story about it. It is not as difficult, given the conclusions of these pieces of research that a lot of this work's being based on, to actually address it. So to me, the biggest issue is politically, for example, do we want to address this? And if somebody tells me tomorrow we need to do some more on ESG, the problems that have been detailed can be handled. They're not things that we don't already do for other kinds of assets or liabilities or whatever on the financial statements. But having said that, I think from an accounting standpoint, one of the major changes we've seen over time is the change in the kinds of businesses that we're dealing with. So when I was going through, and many people were going through, it was a manufacturing situation. And now if you look at it, manufacturing is probably 34% of gross national product. So we see a lot more retail service kinds of things. And when you get into those areas, you see a whole different set of problems for accounting. We're not very good at valuation, I will say that. And if you look at PCAOB and their audit deficiencies, the work that they do, and the lawsuits that are filed against clients and accounting firms, valuation tends to be a real issue. We're very good at cost items. So if you ask me how much does I don't know, controls over pollution, what does that cost? I can give you a number. or at least close to a number. The value added of those pollution controls is much more difficult to determine. So we're in that kind of world where we can't train our students to do this because we're not very good at it. And if you look again, it's just the change. I wish I could say that we're much better over these 30, 40, 50 years, but we're not. So as far as training, I would say the curriculum has changed for these students in a sense that there's more classes in the major, more information to be covered in the major, and many more students minor in something now. So you might be an accounting major minoring in finance. If that's the case, you'll have a different perspective on these things than just your pure accounting major. You'll be looking at it from a user standpoint. So I think the curriculum, I think most universities, analytics, a double major, because everything that anybody's doing is now analytics. So you see students broadening their areas, but I'm not sure the accounting textbooks, other than being extremely lengthy, have really changed and made us much more, much better able to address some of these issues. So bottom line is, conclude on this, I don't think we would have a problem handling ESG at some level, because the normal rule when I was in public accounting was when in doubt, disclose. And unless somebody says you can't disclose this stuff, then I think that's a good rule to follow, and we could handle that.
Well, I'm glad you at least ended on an upbeat, because you weren't sounding too upbeat at the beginning. But Larry, were you?
Well, I can speak to the deployment of ESG topics in the law school curriculum, and I agree with Kent that we haven't put it into the first year. It gets into the second year courses on topics we've discussed today: Delaware corporation law, federal securities regulation, and you might have a, same as Kent was saying, a seminar on ESG in the third year. And so students with an appetite or an interest can certainly pursue studies in this field. I would then add, there's a burgeoning research literature on all aspects of this. So professors in the room, our friend from Rutgers, professors from the finance department do deep and significant research in this area, and obviously they will from time to time enlist research assistants and fellows to help them. So I think it's the themes, the topics are certainly available and being developed and taught in universities. But I agree with Kent. I think there are a lot of other fundamentals that have to be taught before you could really understand and add value in this space.
I'm jumping around on topics, but we don't have a lot of time. I want to make sure we get everything covered. So, Paulia, you were describing that your client base is really the national size, or you are a national size public accounting firm, and your client base are, I'm going to call it the smaller reporting companies.
For the most part, yes.
So a little bit more about where all of this that we've been talking about today fits in with smaller reporting companies compared to, because I frankly think most of everyone else up here is focused on and spends their time with the largest
The larger,
companies.
yeah.
So you're coming at it from a different place.
We are coming from a very different angle, of course, because the small reporting companies do not have the liquidity or resources that larger corporations do. And so many of them basically survive from round of financing to the next round of financing. The boards feel compelled to invest in their core business processes and objectives, whether it's R&D research or manufacturing, generating steady return. And so voluntary initiatives like this do not exist. They've been looking and asking questions on the SEC rule that is stayed now on climate change. There was a lot of concern around that, the volume of work, the volume of disclosure. Our firm also put out a letter describing the challenges with auditability of the disclosures that were placed in proposed Article 14 of SEC that would have impacted pretty much every SEC reporting company, including the smaller reporting companies. So that would have been very, very costly and burdensome to them from a financial reporting perspective, redesigning accounting systems, hiring up personnel. And so it's a completely different ballgame. I don't want to minimize it, but one other comment I'd like to make that while there's a lot of talk about ESG, I'm not sure whether folks realize that the assurance profession and the assurance services over ESG and climate change metrics are, in my personal view, in their infancy. So per the latest CAQ report on ESG reporting, there were only 11 reasonable assurance reports issued on climate change metrics in 2022 by public accounting firms, large ones like Ernst & Young that Paul represents, and about 51 issued by other service providers. So that is not a lot. There isn't that much experience out there, and any kind of legislative or regulatory mandate that would push down that to much smaller firms and much smaller registrants would have been very burdensome.
Okay, so Larry, this is to you, you being our Delaware law expert now up here.
Thanks, Bill.
Well, Bill could raise his hand if he
If I need
wants
your
to.
help, Bill.
But all these companies that Polly is talking about, not all of them, but the vast majority are Delaware corporations.
Yes.
So we're hearing that it's a lot harder for them to do all the nice things that Bill was talking about earlier. Any concerns about that?
Yeah,
or-
no, we've got, 2.2 million business organizations franchised here in Delaware, and only a small portion are the big public companies, so it's mostly Polia's clients. And yeah, these are, everything we're talking about here is really expensive to do. All of the tracking, the calculating, the reporting, all of the processes, all the board reviews. I love how Michael keeps talking about precious time. It's the one resource we cannot replicate, and yet all of this takes enormous amounts of time. And if you're a wealthy person or a resourceful corporation, it might be relatively easy and painless to do a lot of this work. But if you're a small company, it's not easy. And Delaware appreciates all of that. And so we have, it's a very business-friendly state. We like to provide fairness, predictability, adaptability, and efficiency. So we try to impose as little as possible on our business organizations. Bill explained that it requires boards to exercise good faith business judgment in making their decisions, and that body of law is invariant to size or complexity, and the degree of deference is just as much. So I think Delaware corporate citizens have nothing to fear one way or the other, about where the pendulum is on the ESG framework. In listening to Polia's talk and comparing it with Paul, I think the world of the large corporation is very different from the world of the small one. And so is the entire ecosystem that they're in, the advisors they have, the incentives that they have. I talked earlier about the ecosystem of ESG that grew up as this movement spawned. And there's a lot of large organizations who have a lot of resources to deploy and a lot of gain. For the smaller company and the smaller advisors, the incentives are the other way around. And so it's a very interesting disconnect, and I'm very grateful for the chance to add that perspective.
Yeah, I also want to throw in here, I'm not sure whether you noticed, but I ran some statistics before coming here, and we lost about 900 SEC registrants domestically from 2023 to 2024. And we see it every day in our line of work. They don't sustain financially. The boards have to conserve resources. They delist, they register, and the universe of publicly traded companies here in the U.S. is shrinking. And a lot of it is a lot of regulation, a lot of burden, in addition to a highly litigious environment. So,
well, maybe touching on that, and I don't want to lose, I want a couple points. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that, there's sort of this view that this is easy for large companies. It's not. And it's about trade-offs, and they have limited time, and, we're in an environment, or we were in an environment where corporations were being, forced to take more time related to this relative to some of the other topics that were here, about value creation and, taking away from that and focusing it on one aspect of, a company. Just a quick aside, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we have less public companies. There's a lot of private capital out there that is giving very favorable terms, and companies are leaving because, you know, PE and others can provide better financing, lower cost of capital relative to being in the public market. So that one, I know that's a popular refrain of the U.S. is overregulated. Regulation does drive down cost of capital, but that's a much more complicated issue because there is a lot of private credit out there.
John, if I could just add, if ESG disappears, and you guys know this much better than I do, we have to remember from the finance side of things, the market is efficient, and when they see someone not from going to providing ESG data and then not providing it anymore when it's still voluntary, let's say it's voluntary, that's a signal sent to the market, and the market will adjust on those kind of companies that do that. So you're not home free if it's just all of a sudden we don't have to do it and you don't volunteer. For example, Coca-Cola and Norvitas both said they're going to continue ESG regardless of what happens here. So these companies are sending a signal that they not only think it's important, but that they're going to still play that game that they need to. So we need to remember, regardless of what happens, there are signals to the stock market.
Okay. So I'm actually going to talk about a point that I feel strongly about here in a moment, but we're also going to go down the line and ask each of you to give what you think the most important things that the audience should take away from this 3 hours, and should go into each of the $500 papers, or at least the winners. I don't know, who's doing the judging anyway, Larry?
Me and my staff.
Oh, okay.
My staff and I.
Just checking on that. And we'll give extra time to Mary down at the end, because she is, in every panel I've ever been on, she's my favorite on giving practical takeaways, which is what I would want us all to do. But Paul, you mentioned the word a little bit earlier about reliable data. And I'm so fixated on it, I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to focus on it because I think it's very important for directors to focus on the importance of having reliable ESG-related data. Back in the 2010 release, there were no metrics required. What we've seen over the last 15 years since then is an increasing presence of metrics. In sustainability reports, not as much actually required yet, although California and Europe are going to require metrics, but there is an increased use of metrics. And many, many companies, as they are producing these metrics, are producing them not by I'll say it, the ESG folks, but not the people that I think that are best at producing metrics. And I think the importance of having, I'm going to call it the controllership finance function involved in metrics is very, very high, and that every director should be focused on that. I have my little list here just to drive it home, but controllership understands IT infrastructure versus spreadsheets, which is what the ESG group tends to use. They know how to format data when you collect it. They know about internal consistency across all your product lines and your different subsidiaries around the world. They understand maintaining records so that you can repeat the same data. They understand management review controls to look at it. And they understand skepticism and pushback. That's what the finance function understands. Really, there's no one else in companies that understand those principles, and those are the principles that underlie reliable data. So that's my little accounting spiel and my accounting takeaway, if I want to call it that. But I will then, let's just go right down the panel here and ask for the takeaway. That means you get to send people to cocktails, Larry.
Excellent. I'm
When it
looking
gets
forward to
you,
that. That's
you'll-
awesome.
So you'll
Anybody
figure out how
thirsty?
much time you have when we get to 5 o'clock. But, Michael, you're next to me, so we'll start down that one.
Thank you, John. First of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to be part of this, this wonderful panel and some of our colleagues that are now in the audience. And thank all of you for being here, because by your presence, you're signaling that this is something that is very important, and I think it is, and thank you for being part of it. For those of us that are in the boardroom and that are part of the governance ecosystem and involved in the profession of directorship, don't lose sight of what your fundamental role and responsibility ultimately is in the boardroom. Understand that, and understand the definition, understand the sort of division of labor and why you're there. Overseeing strategy, monitoring the performance of the company, risk management and such, not to run the company. Be mindful of and pay attention to the regulatory environment, the regulatory winds, and seeing how those movements are going on. Tap into your experts and the management team. And I'm glad you brought out the finance function, because I have a bias towards
Do you like my 6 points?
those folks.
Okay.
Because they do have quite a bit of experience when it comes to internal controls, compliance, risk management, and so forth. And so when issues like, or topics like ESG happen to arise, you can tap into those sources of expertise. Tap into, I'm a big fan of internal audit. Not all companies, clearly the smaller companies sometimes can't afford to have an internal audit team, but when you have the luxury of having an internal audit team, tap into that source. Tap into your outside advisors as well. You know, your external auditor, as well as those that are experts in particular domains, and incorporate that insight into making informed decisions at the board level. You're there as a director to look over the horizon, around the bend, and keep it broad. And don't get too distracted by the minutia. The executive teams pretty much have to take care of those details. So that's what I would offer as a couple of points.
That sounded like nose in, fingers out.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay,
So
Ann.
I would echo everything that Michael said, but as a director of a company, if you decide the company does want to report on these issues, have the robust processes, controls around it, and make sure, as we went back to linking it to strategy and the long-term shareholder value of the company, making sure that the issues that you decide to report on are linked to that, and that you can articulate that as you are putting that information out.
This can sound like a little bit of a broken record, but if you're on a board or you're advising a board, making sure that, you know, the company, as they go on their journey of reporting around ESG and other items, that you've got very strong processes around it, and you treat them the same you do with your financial statements in terms of having robust processes. That's where the finance department can play an incredibly important role. For those outside and for those in the board, continue to pay attention to the regulatory space. There's a lot that's going to happen over the next 6-9 months that will probably pretty significantly change the future of what this looks like.
Kent?
Yeah, I'd say, given the importance of corporations in our everyday lives, I would hope that boards would, when in doubt, do the right thing. And regardless of what the requirements are for disclosure, whatever, do the right thing, because again, it's part of everything that we do. The influence is incredible. And since I'm sitting in Delaware, I can look and say, I think DuPont wishes they had done the right thing with Chemours just a year or so ago, and that their board had done something a little bit differently along those lines, because they will live with that stain about pushing all the negative stuff to Chemours and being sued by a former division. So when in doubt, to me, regardless of the rules, do the right thing.
Yeah, very well said, Kent. I would also say, when in doubt, do the right thing. If you're a student, I know most of you are board members, but if you're a student in the audience, I would say there is room to grow and practice in this space of ESG reporting. I personally don't believe it's going to end. It's going to continue on a voluntary basis. It's going to be required in some jurisdictions, likely going forward. But I would focus your effort on advisory services. You're more likely to get more employers interested in you, and there are many more service providers there, including national size accounting firms like us that are looking to grow the advisory side of the businesses and developing those measures and developing disclosure controls around them for completeness and accuracy.
Okay, Mary and Larry, you have 3 minutes between the two of you.
Take as much time as you want.
And 5 o'clock in cocktails.
Well, a lot of wisdom has been imparted, which leaves not as much that comes to top of mind for me. But I guess reinforcing the point made about being inclusive of the different functions. So regardless of whether the task and accountability sits in your organization of doing the reporting, you should have full alignment across the different functions. Recognize that a company communicates on different platforms. Your financial reports, your other SEC filings, your voluntary reports, your just public statements, and there are a lot of plaintiffs' lawyers, regulators motivated to find a disconnect. And so you need to have all these different internal stakeholders in the room when you think about what you're going to disclose, how you disclose it, how you represent that, and make sure there's no daylight between the different functions as you put that out there into the market.
Agreed with Mary about the fountain of wisdom from which we've all just drunk, so I've got little to add other than to emphasize a very Delaware view, which is that one size does not fit all. Every company is different, every board is different. Indeed, one thing to really remember about a board of directors is that while it's a legal construct, it's a social creature. And so a board is only as good as the interaction among its members. And I think one of the most important things is developing the culture of the board, and that includes lots of meetings in between meetings. Rarely are significant debates developed and resolved at formal board meetings. Usually all the serious discussion occurs outside of that, and it occurs in phone calls for sure in between meetings, but it's lunches and other gatherings. And so the lawyers in the room, the accountants too, just should always appreciate that there's a lot of chemistry, ineffable, that all the rules and regulations can't, or even the measurements, can't really capture. And so everyone will be a little different, and I think Delaware has long appreciated that. And that's why we have the fluid, flexible fiduciary framework that Bill Rafferty talked about, the deferential business judgment rule. It really appreciates that there's no one size fits all. And I brought us in with, what, 30 seconds? Do I have to announce the...
I'm going to take the 30 seconds.
Can I get 2 of them?
No. Can you please fill out the evaluations? The idea of having the questions in the middle, which I thought was, again, just excellent today, came out of those evaluations. We need your help and ideas.
Okay, very important, but more important than that, are there any Philadelphia Eagles fans in the room? I know Nicole is. Well, Nicole and I selected the refreshments. We hope you'll appreciate them, and one of them is a Philadelphia Micro Brew. So that's in honor of the Eagles. So thank you all very much. Thank you, John, for putting this together all these years. Thank all of you, the panelists. We'll see you outside by the fireplace.